French cavalry saber severely disfigured his face and destroyed his left eye during the Battle of Tournai in 1794, but Prince Ernest Augustus survived to become Britain's most hated royal. Behind the locked doors of St. James's Palace, his clandestine liaisons concealed a secret so destructive it required the cold-blooded murder of his own servant to protect the British crown. The terror Ernest instilled in the British public was magnified by the collapsing state of the House of Hanover at the turn of the 19th century. King George III was descending into the agonizing, permanent mental illness that would eventually lock him away in the dark halls of Windsor Castle. The vacuum of power at the top of the British Empire left the nation at the mercy of the king's sons. The Duke of Wellington, a military commander who had faced Napoleon's artillery without flinching, looked ahead at the royal dukes and shuddered, famously calling them the millstone about the neck of the government. While his older brothers drowned in public scandals and illegitimate affairs, failing entirely to secure the dynasty, Ernest was different. He was competent, highly intelligent, and inherently dangerous. A creature of strict military discipline, he was molded not as a refined British gentleman, but as a Prussian-style authoritarian. Educated in Germany at the University of Göttingen, he was molded not as a refined British gentleman, but as a Prussian-style authoritarian. He despised the press. He loathed the concept of democracy. As the French Revolution demonstrated the brutal consequences of a public uprising, the British establishment lived in a state of constant paranoia. The working class, crushed by the economic toll of constant war and rapid industrialization, was looking at their own bloated aristocracy with growing fury. Within this volatile political climate, Ernest Augustus positioned himself as the ultimate hardliner. In the House of Lords, his towering, scarred figure intimidated political opponents. His voice boomed out in aggressive opposition to every single progressive measure introduced to Parliament. When politicians debated the abolition of the slave trade, Ernest aggressively defended the institution, arguing it was vital for the empire's wealth and military dominance. When reformers pushed for Catholic emancipation, a political move absolutely necessary to prevent a bloody civil war in Ireland, Ernest swore he would rather see the empire tear itself apart than allow Catholics the right to vote. He viewed any concession to the public, no matter how small or practical, as a fatal weakness that would inevitably lead the monarchy to the guillotine. And as the years ticked by, a horrifying reality began to settle over the British political establishment. The older brothers were failing in their one primary royal duty, producing a legitimate heir to secure the dynasty. The Prince of Wales had only one legitimate child, Princess Charlotte. The Duke of York had no children. The Duke of Clarence had no legitimate heirs. The line of succession was a fragile, collapsing bridge. With every passing year and with every barren royal marriage, Ernest Augustus moved one step closer to the throne. The man with the mutilated face, the man who openly despised the British public and actively fought against their rights, was creeping steadily toward absolute power. The politicians knew it, the press knew it, and the people knew it, but his political tyranny was only the public face of the Duke of Cumberland. Behind the heavily guarded doors of his private apartments at St. James's Palace, a different kind of darkness was taking root. Ernest maintained a household that operated far outside the bounds of conventional aristocratic norms. In a Victorian society that was beginning to strictly order itself by class rigidity and moral purity, the Duke's inner sanctum was a place of suffocating secrecy, intense favoritism, and dangerous hidden liaisons. He surrounded himself with a tight, fiercely guarded circle of male servants. He routinely elevated foreign valets and common laborers to positions of unusual intimacy and unchecked power within his household, bypassing the traditional aristocratic aides who usually populated a royal court. Among these men was an Italian immigrant named Joseph Sellis. Sellis was a valet who had served the Duke for over a decade. He was a man who had learned the intricate, quiet rhythms of a royal master who trusted almost no one. A servant in that era was expected to be an invisible ghost, tending to the fires, drawing the baths, and maintaining the wardrobe without ever truly being seen or heard. But invisibility grants unparalleled access. Sellis understood the deep vulnerabilities of the Duke's private life. He knew the names and faces of the men who came and went in the dead of night. He witnessed the financial disparities, the sudden bursts of violent royal rage, and the terrifying lavish favors bestowed upon other servants, particularly a newly favored valet named Cornelius Neil Sainst. James's palace was not just a royal residence, it was a labyrinth of echoing corridors, hidden servant staircases, and heavily locked doors. It was an environment deliberately designed to keep the outside world blind to the realities of royal life. But inside that sealed ecosystem, intense pressure was building. Resentment among the staff regarding Cornelius Neil's rapid rise in the Duke's affections was metastasizing into something volatile. A royal duke, insulated by unimaginable wealth and absolute legal privilege, believed he was untouchable. Ernest believed the severe laws that governed the common man, laws that demanded the gallows for what the state deemed unnatural acts, would never breach his bedroom door. He operated with the impunity of a man who knew he was a heartbeat away from becoming king. He was entirely wrong. Someone in the shadows of the palace was watching closely. Someone had gathered the exact details of the Duke's intimate, illicit relationship with Neil, and that someone was carefully calculating the exact price of the crown's most dangerous, destructive secret. While the aristocracy paraded their wealth and military triumphs through the broad avenues of London, the private lives of the populace were governed by a draconian penal code. At the very top of the list of offenses that horrified Georgian society was the crime of sodomy. It was not merely considered a sin, it was classified as a capital felony, an act so corrosive to the social order that the state demanded the ultimate penalty. Men caught in such acts were dragged before the courts, stripped of their property, and publicly hanged. Even those who faced lesser charges of attempted sodomy were subjected to the pillory, where furious mobs hurled cobblestones, dead animals, and filth at them, sometimes beating the accused to death before the sentence was even complete. The social annihilation was absolute. Ernest Augustus knew this law. As a staunch conservative in the House of Lords, he was one of the loudest voices demanding the strict preservation of such draconian punishments. Yet, the Duke of Cumberland operated under the fatal delusion that royal blood provided an impenetrable shield against the laws of men. Inside the heavy brick walls of St. James's Palace, the physical reality of royal life was vastly different from the public spectacle. St. James's was not a modern, airy residence. It was a sprawling, suffocating Tudor relic, a maze of narrow corridors, low ceilings, and interlocking chambers. Privacy was a physical impossibility. The architecture itself forced an unnatural proximity between the highest echelon of the British Empire and the working-class men hired to maintain them. A royal duke did not dress himself, bathe himself, or even tend to his own fires. Every intimate moment of his daily existence was managed by the hands of his servants. For years, the duke's household had been a volatile environment, largely due to the aggressive and unpredictable nature of Ernest himself. He was known to strike his staff in fits of rage, using his heavy walking stick or a riding crop. But physical violence was an accepted hazard of serving the aristocracy. What began to unsettle the Cumberland household was a sudden, jarring shift in the internal hierarchy, a shift that broke the unspoken rules of the master-servant relationship. The disruption arrived in the form of Cornelius Neil. Neil was an Irish servant who lacked the long tenure typically required for close proximity to a prince of the blood. Yet almost overnight, Neil was elevated. The Duke began to exhibit a glaring, intense preference for the Irishman. Neil was granted unprecedented access to the Duke's private chambers at all hours. He was seen wearing fine clothes that far exceeded a standard servant's wages. He was handed control over household funds and given the authority to command men who technically outranked him. To the outside world, this might have looked like eccentric royal favoritism, but to the men living in the claustrophobic servant quarters, it was a glaring red flag. The nature of the Duke's relationship with Neil stepped over the line of patronage and descended into a dangerous intimacy. Ernest Augustus, the man who publicly championed the rigid stratification of British classes, was privately engaging in what was known in the criminal underworld as rough trade, the risky practice of wealthy, powerful men crossing deep class boundaries to purchase the sexual compliance of working-class laborers. For a royal prince to submit to a servant behind locked doors was an act of extreme vulnerability. It handed unparalleled leverage to a man who had everything to gain and nothing to lose, and it deeply alienated the one man who had dedicated his life to anticipating the Duke's every need. Joseph Sellis. Sellis was an immigrant, a man of Corsican and Italian descent, who had spent over a decade meticulously working his way up the domestic ladder to become the Duke's senior valet. Unlike the bachelor servants who lived entirely within the palace ecosystem, Sellis had a life outside the walls. He had a wife and 4 children living in London. He was constantly burdened by the financial pressure of supporting them on a fixed royal stipend, a stipend that rarely arrived on time due to the Duke's perpetual mismanagement of funds. Sellis was a proud, highly observant man, and his physical health was failing. He suffered from chronic asthma and was physically slight, a stark contrast to the towering, imposing figure of his master. For years, Sellis had endured the Duke's violent temper and the grueling hours, believing his loyalty would eventually secure a comfortable pension for his family. Instead, he was pushed aside. He was forced to stand in the shadows of the antechamber, while Cornelius Neil, a man Sellis viewed as an uncultured upstart, walked freely into the Duke's bedroom and closed the door. The humiliation was absolute. Sellis watched as Neil siphoned off the financial perks, the cast-off royal clothing, and the influence that rightfully belonged to the senior valet. But Sellis did not simply retreat into quiet bitterness. He began to watch. He began to listen. The thin wooden doors of St. James's Palace offered little resistance to a man actively seeking the truth. Sometime in the early months of 1810, the resentment crystallized into direct knowledge. The exact nature of what Sellis witnessed remains buried under 2 centuries of royal cover-ups, but historical consensus and the frantic reactions of the crown suggest Sellis caught the Duke and Cornelius Neil in a deeply compromising situation. The senior valet suddenly possessed the single most destructive piece of information in the British Empire. The power dynamic inverted instantly. Ernest Augustus, the scarred military commander who terrified the House of Lords, was now entirely at the mercy of his disgruntled asthmatic valet. If Sellis walked out of St. James's Palace and handed his story to the radical press, the monarchy would face an existential crisis. The British public already despised Ernest. The revelation that the ultra-conservative Duke was actively engaging in sodomy with a servant would not just destroy his political career, it would legally demand his execution. It would shatter the moral authority of the Hanoverian dynasty and potentially rip the crown away from the royal family entirely, paving the way for a republic. Joseph Sellis understood the explosive nature of his discovery. Modern historical consensus suggests that instead of fleeing, he made a fatal calculation. Likely driven by chronic financial anxiety, Sellis appears to have initiated a quiet, high-stakes campaign of blackmail. The atmosphere inside the Duke's apartments turned toxic. The day-to-day operations of the household became a theater of psychological warfare. Sellis began to make demands. He demanded better accommodations. He demanded increased wages. He challenged the Duke's authority in small, subtle ways that would have previously resulted in a severe beating, knowing the Duke was entirely paralyzed by the threat of exposure. Sellis was pulling the strings of a royal puppet, but blackmailing a man like Ernest Augustus was akin to playing with a live explosive. The Duke was not a man who surrendered to humiliation. He was a survivor of the battlefield, a man who believed in striking first and striking hard. As May 1810 progressed, the tension within the locked doors of St. James's reached an unbearable pitch. The Duke felt the walls closing in. He knew Sellis would never be satisfied. A blackmailer's price only ever increases, and the risk of Sellis accidentally or deliberately leaking the secret to the rampant London newspapers grew by the hour. The situation was unsustainable. A permanent solution was required. The Duke of Cumberland, alongside his loyal confidant Neil, realized that the only way to protect the throne, their lives, and the future of the British monarchy was to silence Joseph Sellis forever. The sprawling corridors of St. James's Palace, built to protect royal blood, were about to become a slaughterhouse. As the sun set over London on May 31, 1810, casting long dark shadows across the cobblestones of Pall Mall, Joseph Sellis finished his duties for the evening. He bid the other servants good night and walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward his private quarters. He closed his heavy wooden door and locked it from the inside. Believing himself safe, believing his leverage made him untouchable, he had no idea that the machinery of his own destruction had already been set into motion. The midnight hour inside St. James's Palace did not bring peace. It brought a heavy, oppressive stillness, broken only by the distant footsteps of the outer guards and the settling of ancient wooden floorboards. The architectural layout of the Duke of Cumberland's apartments was a claustrophobic network of connecting rooms. To reach the outer hallway from the Duke's private bedchamber, one had to pass through a series of smaller dressing rooms and antechambers. Joseph Sellis's room was situated at the end of a narrow, dimly lit passage, deliberately separated from the main flow of the royal household, but close enough to be summoned at a moment's notice. On the night of May 31, 1810, Sellis had retreated to this room, pulling the heavy wooden door shut and sliding the iron bolts securely into place. He went to bed believing that the walls of the palace and the explosive secret he held offered him absolute protection. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the suffocating silence of the royal wing was violently shattered. It began with a frantic, guttural shouting echoing from the Duke's bedchamber. A heavy thud reverberated through the floorboards, followed by the crashing of overturned furniture. Then came the voice of Ernest Augustus, roaring in the dark. He was not calling for the palace guard. He was not calling for his senior valet, Joseph Sellis. He was screaming for Cornelius Neil, whose own quarters were situated nearby, arrived at the Duke's door within seconds. He found the Duke of Cumberland standing in the center of the room, a massive, terrifying figure silhouetted in the dim light, bleeding profusely from his head and hands. The Duke's version of the next few minutes was instantly codified into the official royal narrative, repeated so frequently and with such aggressive certainty that it became the only legally acceptable version of events. According to Ernest, he had been deep in sleep when a sudden, heavy blow struck him across the right side of his head. Blinded by the sudden shock and the blood pouring into his good eye, he rolled desperately out of bed. He claimed that an unseen assassin, armed with the Duke's own regimental cavalry sword, continued to hack at him in the darkness. Ernest stated he fought back barehanded, sustaining deep defensive cuts to his palms and fingers as he grappled with the blade, before the phantom assailant finally broke away and fled into the dark corridors. The household was mobilized into a state of absolute panic. Servants, roused from their sleep, spilled into the hallways carrying flickering lanterns. Palace guards with drawn bayonets rushed up the staircases. The Duke's bedchamber was a scene of chaos. The bed linens were soaked in blood. The heavy regimental sword, smeared with crimson, lay discarded on the floor near the doorway. Amidst the screaming and the frantic search for a killer lurking in the shadows, a glaring absence became apparent. Joseph Sellis was nowhere to be found. A group of guards and servants, led by the Duke's inner circle, began to sweep the apartments. The lantern light revealed a gruesome path. A distinct trail of blood droplets led away from the Duke's bedroom, down the narrow, creaking passage, terminating directly in front of the locked door of Joseph Sellis. They pounded on the heavy wood. They shouted his name. There was no answer. The silence from within the room was absolute. Taking an axe from the fire duty station, the guards battered the door frame until the iron bolt tore free from the splintering wood. The door swung open. The men carrying the lanterns stepped into the small, windowless room, their breath catching in their throats. The stench of raw, exposed blood hit them immediately. Joseph Sellis was lying on his narrow bed. He was wearing his nightshirt. The room was perfectly intact. There were no overturned chairs, no signs of a struggle, no scattered clothing. It was a scene of terrifying clinical stillness. Sellis was completely dead. The cause of death was not a mystery. It was displayed with horrifying anatomical clarity. His throat had been cut, but it was not a standard laceration. The blade, a straight razor found discarded on the floor a few feet from the bed, had been driven into the left side of his neck with an astonishing, savage force. The cut ripped through the jugular vein, completely severed the windpipe, sliced through the carotid artery, and only stopped because the steel blade had wedged itself violently into the cervical spine. The man's head was nearly detached from his torso. As the initial shock subsided, the men standing in that room, many of whom had seen the brutal realities of industrial accidents or wartime injuries, began to notice the physical impossibilities of the scene before them. The narrative that had already begun to circulate, that Sellis had failed in his assassination attempt, fled back to his room, locked the door, and taken his own life in a fit of panic and remorse, shattered against the hard physical evidence of the corpse. A man attempting suicide by cutting his own throat must pull the blade across his neck. As the carotid artery is severed, blood pressure plummets instantly. The brain is starved of oxygen in a matter of seconds, leading to immediate shock, loss of motor control, and unconsciousness. It is medically impossible for a man, acting alone, to maintain the extreme physical leverage and sheer muscular force required to carve through the thick muscles of the neck, sever the trachea, and grate a razor against his own spinal column. Even if one were to suspend all biological logic and accept the physical possibility of the wound, the posture of the body told a different, chilling story. When a human being dies from massive, sudden hemorrhage, the body goes into violent spasms. It is an agonizing, chaotic death. Yet Joseph Sellis lay squarely on his back. His head rested perfectly in the center of his pillow. His eyes were closed, his legs were straightened. Most damning of all, his hands were laid neatly by his sides, resting gently on the mattress. A man does not violently hack off his own head and then neatly arrange his posture for the undertaker. The blood evidence further dismantled the illusion of suicide. An arterial bleed from a severed carotid sprays blood outward with the force of a pumping heart. If Sellis had cut his own throat while sitting or standing by the bed, the walls and the floor would have been painted with a distinct high-velocity arterial cast-off. Instead, the vast majority of the blood was pooled, heavily soaking into the mattress directly beneath his neck, indicating he was lying flat and immobile when the fatal cut was made. But the most damning piece of evidence sat quietly in the corner of the room. On a small wooden stand near the door sat a porcelain wash basin. The water inside it was heavily tinged with blood. A man cannot merely decapitate himself, lie down on his bed, arrange his hands, and then get up to wash the blood from his fingers. The bloody water meant someone else had been in the room. Someone had stood over Joseph Sellis, executed him with a single, devastating application of force, walked over to the basin to wash the evidence from their hands, and then slipped out of the room. The locked door, which seemed to confirm the suicide theory, was a simple mechanical illusion. The doors in the servant quarters of St. James's Palace were fitted with spring-loaded locks. A person could easily slide the bolt into the locked position while the door was open, step out into the hallway, and pull the door shut behind them, leaving the room perfectly secured from the inside. As the servants and guards stood staring at the mutilated body of the senior valet, A cold, unspoken realization settled over the room. The men exchanged terrified glances. They looked at the neatly arranged corpse, the impossible depth of the wound, the bloody water in the basin. Then their minds turned back to the Duke of Cumberland, sitting in his bedchamber, bleeding from wounds that were conveniently superficial, surrounded by men absolutely loyal to him, with Cornelius Neil standing rigidly by his side. Nobody spoke the truth aloud. To accuse a royal duke of a cold-blooded assassination was high treason. It meant a one-way trip to the gallows. The hierarchy of power demanded compliance, and the machinery of the British state was already moving to crush the truth before the sun even rose over London. The murder of Joseph Sellis was complete. The cover-up was about to begin. The discovery of Joseph Sellis's mutilated body inside his locked room acted as a brutal catalyst. In the minutes following the breaching of the door, the atmosphere inside the Duke of Cumberland's apartments shifted from chaotic panic to a cold, militaristic lockdown. The men who stood over the bloody mattress were not investigators. They were royal dependents. Their livelihoods, their social standing, and their very freedom were entirely tethered to the goodwill of the House of Hanover. When the impossible physics of the suicide scene became glaringly apparent, a silent, collective decision was made. The truth was too dangerous to survive the night. The immediate priority was not to preserve the crime scene, but to control the narrative. Before the sun even began to rise over the soot-stained rooftops of London, the heavy oak doors of St. James's Palace were barred. Orders were quietly issued by the Duke's inner circle, explicitly forbidding any servant or guard from leaving the royal apartments or communicating with anyone in the outer courtyards. The sprawling palace, already a fortress of privilege, became an impenetrable crime scene controlled entirely by the primary suspect. Outside the palace walls, the early 19th century system of law enforcement was beginning to wake up. London did not yet have a centralized metropolitan police force, but it did have the Bow Street Runners, a professional, independent group of investigators who were highly experienced in reading blood spatter, examining bodies, and interrogating suspects. When the first confused reports of a midnight assassination attempt on a royal duke leaked out to the street, the local magistrates and independent constables rushed to St. James's Palace. They were met with locked gates and armed soldiers. In a standard murder investigation, the first few hours are the golden window. It is the time when blood dries, when alibis are uncoordinated, and when the physical geography of the crime speaks the loudest. The Bow Street Runners understood this. They demanded entry to examine the Duke's bedchamber and the servants' quarters. They were flatly refused. The officers of the Crown asserted royal prerogative. The independent agents of the law were forced to stand on the cobblestones outside, completely locked out of the investigation during the most critical hours of the cover-up. Inside the sealed apartments, the sanitization of the scene commenced. This was not a subtle operation. It was a frantic, desperate effort to mold the physical environment to match the Duke's alibi. The blood evidence was the most glaring problem. According to the Duke's story, an enraged Sellis had attempted to hack him to death, failed, and then fled down the hallway to his own room. If this narrative were true, the hallway should have been painted with a frantic, heavy trail of cast-off blood from the weapon and the fleeing man. Instead, the trail leading to Sellis's door consisted of neat, distinct droplets, as if blood had been carefully carried and dripped along the floorboards to manufacture a path. Furthermore, the Duke claimed he had leapt from his bed in his nightclothes to fight off his attacker. Yet, when the Duke's heavy outer garments, his coat and trousers, were later discovered, they were found heavily stained with blood. How could a man bleeding in his nightshirt transfer massive bloodstains to clothing he was not wearing? The implications were catastrophic. It suggested the Duke was fully dressed during the violent confrontation, contradicting his entire story of a midnight ambush in bed. Before any independent eyes could document these discrepancies, The royal aides and trusted servants, led by the newly empowered Cornelius Neil, swept through the rooms. The bloody water in Sellis's wash basin, the irrefutable proof that a murderer had washed their hands after slitting the valet's throat, was quietly disposed of. Bloodstains on the floorboards that did not align with the Duke's path of retreat were scrubbed away. The regimental sword, the alleged murder weapon of the assassin, was picked up, moved, handled by multiple people, and effectively wiped of any distinct forensic value. While the physical evidence was being dismantled, the medical establishment was brought in to legitimize the Duke's victimhood. Sir Everard Home, one of the most prominent and ambitious surgeons in London, was summoned to the palace to treat Ernest Augustus. The surgeon's presence was as much a political necessity as a medical one. The crown needed a respected authority to publicly validate the Duke's injuries. When Sir Everard examined the Duke, he found deep lacerations on Ernest's hands and fingers, and cuts to his scalp. These were presented as defensive wounds sustained while grappling with the assassin's sword. However, seasoned military men and street-level investigators later whispered about the nature of these wounds. The cuts were remarkably precise, avoiding severe, permanent damage to tendons or major arteries. To those cynical of the crown, the injuries looked less like the chaotic, desperate hacking of a midnight assassin swinging a heavy cavalry blade in the dark, and more like superficial wounds deliberately inflicted to support a fabricated alibi. It was a desperate but highly effective tactic, shedding royal blood to ensure the public focused on the Duke's suffering rather than the dead servant in the back room. As dawn broke on June 1st, the political machinery of the British Empire went into absolute overdrive. The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary were alerted. The survival of the monarchy was already precarious. King George III was locked away in his madness, and the public held an intense, venomous hatred for the royal dukes. If the public believed that the ultra-conservative, deeply despised Duke of Cumberland had brutally executed his own servant to cover up a homosexual affair, the backlash could spark a revolution. The government ministers realized that this was no longer a murder investigation. It was a crisis of state. To legally formalize the Duke's innocence and officially close the case, a coroner's inquest was required. But a standard public inquest ran the risk of exposing the manipulated evidence and allowing independent voices to question the impossible physics of Sellis's death. The Crown could not afford a wild card. They needed a controlled explosion. Instead of allowing the local Middlesex coroner to conduct an open inquiry, the royal household invoked ancient, obscure jurisdictions. They convened a specialized coroner's jury entirely within the confines of the palace. The selection of the jury was a masterclass in political maneuvering. The men chosen to sit in judgment were not impartial citizens. They were local tradesmen, merchants, and individuals who held lucrative royal warrants. Their businesses, their reputations, and their financial survival depended entirely on the patronage of the royal family. They were men who implicitly understood that bringing a verdict of murder against the king's son would mean their own professional annihilation. When the hastily assembled, deeply compromised jury was finally allowed into the royal apartments, the stage was perfectly set. The Bow Street runners were still locked outside. The bloody water was gone. The clothes were hidden. The floors were scrubbed. The jury was led down the narrow corridor to the room of Joseph Sellis. They stood in the doorway, staring at the near-decapitated body of the senior valet, his head resting perfectly on the pillow, his hands laid neatly by his sides. They were told by the coroner, under the watchful, intimidating eyes of royal military officers, that they were looking at a man who had cowardly taken his own life after a failed treasonous attack on his royal master. Any man in that room with a basic understanding of human anatomy knew it was a lie. They saw the impossible depth of the wound. They saw the lack of defensive struggles. But the air in the room was thick with the unyielding pressure of the British crown. The men of the jury looked at the corpse, looked at the royal guards standing at attention, and prepared to deliver the exact verdict the empire demanded of them. The coroner's inquest, convened inside the walls of St. James's Palace, was an exercise in judicial theater, a meticulously staged production designed to deliver a single, preordained conclusion. To understand the sheer weight of the manipulation, one must look at the man selected to lead the jury. Francis Place. Place was not a sycophantic royalist. He was a radical tailor, a prominent figure in the early British labor movement, and a man known for his sharp intellect and independent political leanings. At first glance, placing a known radical as the foreman of a royal jury seemed like an incredibly risky move by the crown. In reality, it was a masterstroke of political engineering. The royal household knew that the public would instantly reject a verdict delivered by a jury of known royal dependents. They needed a credible, independent voice to rubber stamp the official narrative. By the time Francis Place and his jury were finally escorted into the Duke of Cumberland's apartments, the trap had already been set. They were not investigating a raw crime scene. They were being led through a carefully curated museum exhibit of a murder. The jury stood in the doorway of Joseph Sellis's room. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the oppressive presence of royal guards flanking the corridors. They saw the valet lying squarely on his back, the terrifying gash across his throat, his hands resting gently on the mattress. Francis Place was an observant man, but he was working entirely blind. He did not know that the Bow Street runners had been barred from the premises. He did not know about the bloody wash basin that had been quietly spirited away. He did not know about the heavily stained outer garments belonging to the Duke. Place was presented with a locked door, a bloody straight razor lying on the floor, and a dead man. The physical boundaries of his investigation were strictly limited to what the royal household allowed him to see. The inquest proceeded with terrifying speed. Mr. Adams, the coroner for the royal household, directed the proceedings not as a neutral arbiter of facts, but as a prosecutor guiding a narrative. The witness testimonies were a parade of rehearsed, tightly controlled statements. Cornelius Neal, the Irish valet whose rapid assent had triggered the fatal blackmail, took the stand. He testified to the Duke's sudden awakening, the frantic struggle in the dark, and the discovery of the locked door. He painted Sellis as a deeply disturbed, jealous, and financially ruined man who snapped under the pressure of his own perceived grievances. Crucially, the inquest completely ignored the simmering sexual and social tensions that had defined the Duke's household for months. Any servant who might have whispered about the Duke's illicit habits or the rumors of Sellis catching his master in a compromising position with Neal was never called to testify. The scope of the inquiry was deliberately narrowed to the physical events of that single night, divorced entirely from the motive of blackmail. The medical testimony demonstrated a calculated institutional compliance, choosing political survival over anatomical reality. The surgeons who had examined the bodies detailed the defensive wounds on the Duke's hands, validating his claim of a struggle. However, when the questioning turned to the corpse of Joseph Sellis, the medical men evaded the physical impossibilities of the scene. When pressed about the fatal wound, the surgeons equivocated. Despite knowing that a severed carotid artery causes instantaneous unconsciousness, making the physical leverage required to slice through to the spine biologically impossible, they chose political survival over anatomical reality. Ignoring the glaring lack of arterial spray on the walls, the medical witnesses refused to publicly challenge the Crown's narrative and rule out suicide. To state on the official record that Joseph Sellis was murdered would be to accuse the king's son of the crime. The surgeons, reliant on wealthy patrons and royal favor for their careers, chose institutional survival over scientific truth. They testified that while the wound was extraordinarily deep, they could not entirely rule out the possibility of a frenzied suicide. That slight hesitation, that refusal to definitively call it murder, was all the coroner needed. Francis Place and the jury were sent to deliberate. They were ordinary men trapped in the crushing machinery of the state. They had been presented with a neatly packaged story, supported by sworn witness testimony and validated by medical professionals. The contrary evidence had been destroyed before they ever crossed the threshold. While some jurors muttered about the strange posture of the body and the impossible depth of the cut, the overwhelming pressure of the environment forced their hands. They were in the king's palace, surrounded by the king's men. The deliberation was brief. The jury returned the only verdict the crown would accept. Felo de se, felon of himself, Joseph Sellis, was officially declared a murderer and a suicide. Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, was officially declared a victim. The legal firewall had been successfully erected. The consequences of this verdict for the corpse of Joseph Sellis were immediate and barbaric. Georgian law treated suicide not merely as a tragic act, but as a severe crime against God and the king. A man who committed felo de se forfeited all his property to the state, leaving his widow and 4 children entirely destitute. But the punishment extended beyond financial ruin. It demanded the physical desecration of the body. The crown wasted no time. They needed the physical reminder of the crime erased from the palace and the city as quickly as possible. The burial of a suicide was a dark, ritualistic affair designed to humiliate the deceased and terrorize the public. Under the cover of darkness, in the dead of night, the mutilated body of Joseph Sellis was unceremoniously hauled out of St. James's Palace. He was denied a coffin. He was denied a priest. He was thrown into the back of a rough wooden cart, his neck wounds still gaping, and transported through the silent cobblestone streets of London. The destination was a lonely intersection in the parish of St. Paul's, Covent Garden. By law and custom, suicides were buried at crossroads, a superstition rooted in the belief that the intersecting paths would confuse the restless, damned spirit and prevent it from returning to haunt the living. A shallow hole was hastily dug in the dirt. The body of the senior valet, a man who had spent over a decade intimately serving the highest echelons of the British aristocracy, was dumped into the pit. But the ritual was not yet complete. To finalize the punishment and ensure the spirit remained pinned to the earth, a heavy wooden stake was brought forward. With brutal force, the stake was driven directly through Sellis's heart, pinning his corpse to the dirt at the bottom of the grave. The earth was quickly shoveled back over the body, and the paving stones were replaced. By dawn, there was no physical trace left of Joseph Sellis. He had been erased. The palace floors were clean. The royal aides were back at their posts. The Duke of Cumberland, heavily bandaged but legally untouchable, remained secure in his position in the line of succession. The royal household believed the crisis had been managed. They believed that by silencing the blackmailer, destroying the evidence, rigging the inquest, and burying the body at a crossroads, they had successfully buried the truth, but they had vastly underestimated the intelligence and the fury of the British public. The doors of St. James's Palace were thick, but they were not soundproof. The whispers of the bloody wash basin, the scrubbed floors, and the impossible angle of the fatal wound had already slipped through the cracks. The radical press, long constrained by harsh libel laws, began to sharpen its knives. The Duke of Cumberland had survived the night, but he was about to step into a century of relentless, punishing public scrutiny. The dawn that broke over London following the midnight burial of Joseph Sellis brought no resolution to the British crown. The royal establishment had executed a textbook cover-up. They had scrubbed the physical scene, manipulated the medical testimony, intimidated a jury into delivering a convenient verdict, and literally buried the primary witness with a wooden stake through his heart. Legally, the matter was closed. The Duke of Cumberland was a certified victim. But the British public in 1810 was not a docile, unthinking mass. They were a population ground down by decades of relentless war with France, crushing taxation, and the glaring, unchecked corruption of their own aristocracy. They despised the House of Hanover, and they possessed a sharp, cynical intelligence regarding the machinations of power. They knew precisely how the establishment operated. Almost immediately, the walls of St. James's Palace proved entirely porous. A sprawling royal residence requires an army of hundreds to function: maids, scullery boys, stable hands, guards, and laundresses. These were working-class people who lived in the same neighborhoods and drank in the same taverns as the rest of London, and they talked. The details of the crime scene that the Bow Street runners were forbidden to see quickly bled out into the city streets. A laundress whispered about the heavy, blood-soaked outer garments the Duke had supposedly not been wearing. A palace guard muttered over a pint of ale about the bloody wash basin that had vanished from Sellis's room. A coroner's assistant, perhaps feeling the heavy weight of his own compromised conscience, shared the impossible physical reality of a man severing his own neck to the bone and then neatly folding his hands. Within days, the official verdict of suicide was not just doubted, it was actively ridiculed. London was entirely consumed by the Sellis incident. The narrative of the radical press operating in the grimy, ink-stained printing houses of Fleet Street began to take shape. They could not explicitly accuse the king's son of murder without facing the gallows themselves, but they were masters of satire, implication, and political theater. Caricatures and broadsides flooded the streets. They depicted Ernest Augustus with his scarred face and imposing height, holding a dripping razor, while a small, defenseless Italian valet cowered in the shadows. They drew pointed, mocking cartoons about the Duke's sudden, intense affection for his Irish servant, Cornelius Neil, heavily implying the sexual deviance that was the true motive for the bloodshed. The whispers of rough trade and royal sodomy, once confined to the darkened corridors of the palace, became the open gossip of the entire British Empire. Ernest Augustus, severely underestimating the sheer force of public fury, decided to face the storm head-on. He was a man of absolute, unyielding arrogance. He believed that to hide was to show weakness, and he refused to cower before a public he considered entirely beneath him. Once his hand and head wounds had sufficiently healed, he ordered his carriage and rode out into the broad avenues of London, fully expecting the deference demanded by his royal blood. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. As his carriage rolled through the streets, the crowds did not bow. They surged forward, the air filled with deafening hisses, boos, and the visceral, guttural roars of thousands of angry citizens. Cobblestones, rotting vegetables, and handfuls of mud were hurled at the lacquered wood of his carriage. Above the din, a single, unmistakable word was chanted, echoing off the brick facades of the city. "Murderer!" The Duke sat rigidly inside, his scarred face impassive, staring straight ahead as the physical hatred of his future subjects battered his carriage. He was now, without question, the most despised man in Europe. The shadow of Joseph Sellis walked beside him every time he stepped into the public eye. This public branding fundamentally altered the political landscape of Britain. The Duke of Cumberland was not just a disgraced royal. He was the political anchor of the extreme right wing in the House of Lords. He was the most vocal opponent of every major social reform of the 19th century. Whenever Parliament debated the expansion of voting rights, the emancipation of Catholics, or the improvement of working conditions, Ernest Augustus stood up to crush it, but his political power was now fatally compromised by his personal reputation. For the progressive reformers and the radical politicians, the Duke became the ultimate, horrifying symbol of aristocratic tyranny. He embodied everything rotten about the British class system. They pointed to him and argued that a system which allowed a royal duke to butcher a working-class immigrant, cover it up, and then sit in the House of Lords dictating the laws of the land was a system that needed to be torn down to its foundations. For over 2 decades, the establishment maintained a precarious, heavy-handed silence over the true events of May 1810. The government relied on a brutal interpretation of criminal libel to keep the press in line. In the early 19th century, the legal standard for libel was fundamentally different from today. Truth was not a defense. In fact, a popular legal maxim of the era stated, "The greater the truth, the greater the libel." The law was not designed to protect facts. It was designed to protect the peace and the reputation of the powerful. If publishing the truth about a powerful man caused public outrage and damaged his standing, it was considered a severe criminal offense. This legal terror kept the explicit accusations out of the mainstream newspapers. But the hatred simply went underground, simmering and waiting for a fracture in the system. That fracture finally occurred in 1832. The political climate in Britain had reached a boiling point. The nation was fiercely debating the Great Reform Act, a piece of legislation aimed at expanding the voting franchise and eliminating corrupt political boroughs. The country was on the absolute brink of revolution. The Duke of Cumberland, true to form, was threatening to use military force to crush the reform movement. In this highly explosive atmosphere, a radical publisher named Joseph Sellis decided that the time for implication and satire was over. He operated a small printing press and was deeply embedded in the underground network of political dissenters. Sellis gathered every suppressed detail, every leaked piece of forensic evidence, and every whispered rumor regarding the Duke's sexual appetites, and compiled them into a devastating pamphlet. He titled it The Authentic Records of the Court of England for the Last 70 Years. It was an explosive political pamphlet that directly threatened the monarchy. Sellis bypassed metaphors and political cartoons. He explicitly stated, in black ink, that Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, was actively engaged in sodomy with his servant Cornelius Neal. He stated that Joseph Sellis had discovered this capital crime and attempted to blackmail the Duke. And he stated with absolute clarity that Ernest Augustus had cold-bloodedly murdered Sellis to protect himself from the gallows before orchestrating a massive state-sponsored cover-up. The pamphlet sold out instantly. It was passed hand-to-hand in taverns, read aloud in working men's clubs, and slipped under the doors of the aristocracy. The secret that the crown had spent 22 years trying to bury was suddenly illuminated by a blinding spotlight. The royal establishment reacted with the sheer, overwhelming force of a cornered predator. The Duke of Cumberland personally demanded the absolute destruction of Joseph Sellis. He mobilized the finest, most ruthless prosecutors in the British legal system and filed charges of criminal libel. The trial of Joseph Sellis at the Court of King's Bench was not a pursuit of justice. It was a public execution of free speech. Sellis, a man of modest means, stood virtually no chance against the unlimited resources of the state. He attempted to argue the facts. He requested to call witnesses who could testify to the impossible nature of Sellis's wounds and the suspicious behavior of the royal household. The judges, deeply loyal to the crown, shut him down entirely. They strictly enforced the rule that truth was no defense. The only question for the jury was whether Sellis had printed the words, and whether those words were designed to damage the reputation of the king's brother. The outcome was inevitable. Sellis was found guilty. The sentence handed down was designed to serve as a terrifying warning to every printing press in the empire. Sellis was hit with massive, unpayable financial penalties. Stripped of his livelihood and his assets, he was dragged away to a debtor's prison. The conditions inside Victorian debtors' prisons were notoriously horrific. They were disease-ridden, overcrowded nightmares where men were essentially buried alive until their debts were miraculously paid. Joseph Sellis, a man who had dared to speak the open secret of the British Empire, was thrown into this squalor. His business was eradicated. His family was financially ruined. The state ensured that the man who exposed the royal murderer was completely annihilated. The brutal suppression of Joseph Sellis achieved its short-term goal. A profound, chilling silence fell over Fleet Street. Editors and publishers, terrified of joining Sellis in a rat-infested cell, strictly self-censored any mention of the Duke of Cumberland's past. The legal firewall had held. The machinery of state oppression had successfully defended the royal bloodline.